Life in the ancient world was short and brutal, and it could get particularly bad if you were a Roman emperor. Yes, you were one of the most powerful and richest men on earth, but very few emperors had a gentle death. Men like Antoninus Pius, who we can see here on this coin, he died peacefully at age 74, after having an overdose of delicious Alpine cheese. That's actually how he died. Men like Antoninus were the exception. Chances are you would probably succumb to some horrible disease, with the medics of the time not being able to do much about it. Hopefully it was a quick disease that would end it all quickly. But the most common way that Roman emperors met their ends was rather violent. A very large portion of Roman emperors, they met their end through the hands of their own soldiers, through some kind of political coup, or they just managed to piss someone off badly enough. And this is what this video is all about. Pretty coins and gruesome deaths. What a pleasant experience. So, let me show you some really cool coins issued by some of the emperors who had some of the most horrible deaths. Make sure to watch it on an empty stomach. So, let's get straight to it. And we begin with the quintessential bad, evil emperor, Caligula. His reign was fairly short, from 37 to 41 AD, and for a good reason. He was cruel, highly unstable, and a complete idiot politically. He openly humiliated even the most powerful men of the elite, meaning he had a huge list of people who absolutely hated him. One of his own guards, a Praetorian officer who Caligula repeatedly mocked and degraded, he just decided he'd had enough of his BS. So on January of 41 AD, as Caligula was leaving the games on the Palatine Hill and passing through a narrow corridor on his way to lunch, he was ambushed by this Praetorian and other members of Caligula's own personal guard. The first blows struck his neck and upper body. They were likely going for his throat, but the initial attack wasn't enough to kill Caligula. Then, according to records, after he collapsed on the floor, the entire group of attackers fell on him in a frenzy, stabbing him again and again as he lay on the ground. Sources speak of around 30 stab wounds, and some add that the attackers deliberately mutilated his genitals, which just shows how savage and hate-filled the killing was. There are even records of the attackers cutting entire chunks of his body and eating them. This was probably a later addition to the story to make it more dramatic, but still, it must have been incredibly painful. And to illustrate Caligula, we have this denarius here. It was struck at around 40 AD. And I find it particularly fitting that this piece has a series of little scratches and dings, like little stab wounds, just like how Caligula died. Something else that I find interesting about this coin is that at no moment, if we look at it, do these coins show any clear signs of the unhinged character that Caligula had. These coins look rather regal, rather normal. I mean, it's understandable, these were tools of propaganda, they were supposed to show the emperor on a good light, but now that we know what a man he was, it gives these coins an uncanny look. That weird sensation of things look quiet, normal, maybe too quiet and normal. After all, it's Caligula we're looking at here. So anyways, as for the design, on the obverse we have this very pleasant looking portrait of the young man Caligula was during his reign. Maybe his expression here looks a little bit annoyed, he looks very serious, but that was expected on other portraits of the time. And around the legends we read his regnal name, his full regnal name. Gaius Caesar Augustus. Caligula wasn't his name, that was a nickname. His name was Gaius, so Gaius Caesar Augustus, and then his official titles: Pontifex Maximus, Tribunicia Potestate Tertium, Consul Tertium. Looking at the reverse, we have this lovely oak wreath. I particularly enjoy reverses with wreaths. It gives this very balanced look all over the design because it's circular, it fills every crevice of the design. And another cool thing about these crowns, these wreaths, is that there are different kinds of wreaths we can find. Some of them are made out of oak leaves, others of laurel, olive branches, but in this case it's oak. We can distinguish it from the shape of the leaves and the little acorns attached to it. Quite a lot of attention to detail on the die engraver's part. The oak wreath was associated with a Roman award, a decoration, which was called the civic crown. So this was an award given to someone who saved the life of another Roman citizen, which is reinforced on the legends at the center. It reads, Pater Patriae, ob cives servatos, or Father of the Nation, a warder for saving the citizenry. So here Caligula is boasting, saving the lives of all citizens of Rome. Saving them for what? It's anyone's guess. There are no records of any heroic deeds on his part. So this is basically some imperial propaganda just to boost his public image, which makes this coin actually rather ironic. Because of course now we know all of the naughty stuff he's done. In any case, lovely coin. It looks great, and it's like if it hides like a dark secret behind it. Next, let's look at another evil and violent emperor who had an equally violent end, Commodus. Commodus was the last of the great Antonine emperors. He reigned from 177 to 192 AD, and compared to the great rulers of his dynasty, he was a disaster. A man more interested in feeding his own ego and playing gladiator while wearing a Hercules costume. He wasn't really interested in ruling an empire. By the end of his reign, even the people closest to him were living in fear of his dangerous, unpredictable behavior, and so they decided he had to die before he could strike at them first. So on the 31st of December, 192, they tried to poison him, but he vomited it back up, so they had to get their hands dirty and make sure the man was dead. But there was a problem. Commodus apparently was in superb physical shape, hardened by years of training for the arena. He also had previous attempts on his life made, so not only did he train to make sure he fought well in the Colosseum, but he also wanted to defend himself. Therefore, it took another powerful fighter to bring him down, his own personal trainer, a man called Narcissus. After what was most certainly a pretty violent fight, Commodus was finally overpowered and strangled to death on his personal baths, poisoned, beaten into submission, and then drowned. That must have been horrible. And to illustrate Commodus, we have yet another denarius. This one was made at around the year 187, so more towards the end of his reign. And as we can see on the obverse, we have this portrait of Commodus with a long beard. It looks like he inherited the excellent beard genes from his father. He also inherited the curly hair and the large bulging eyes. Sadly, he only inherited the physical appearance part, not the whole philosopher, emperor, conscientious administrator, and competent leader part as well. The legends spell out his full regnal name. They start on the obverse and will carry on to the reverse. Here we can read Marcus Commodus Antoninus, Pius Felix, Augustus Britannicus. Heading to the reverse, we have an image of Felicitas, the incarnation of happiness, holding a scepter and a ceremonial patera. The patera was like a small pot used to offer liquid gifts to the gods during religious ceremonies. Curiously, the common people and the army, like the plebs and the army, they had quite a positive opinion of Commodus. I mean, he kept providing the bread and circuses that the masses of Rome enjoyed so much, and at the end of the day, it was basically all they cared about. And the army kept receiving their payments in time and the bonuses that they expected. This might explain why Commodus lasted as long as he did. The hatred towards him was mostly concentrated on the elites. As for the legends, we start with a small description of the image on the reverse. It starts with Publica Felicitas, or the happiness, the well-being of the public. Then it continues on with the titles he held that year. So it reads Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest, Tribunicia Potestate, powers of the tribune, for the 12th year, Imperator 8, so commander of the army for the 8th year, Consul Quinquem, consul for the 5th year, Pater Patriae, father of the nation. After Commodus, we enter the incredibly violent 3rd century, a century of strong men who became emperor by sheer power of arms, a century of lots of civil wars and foreign invasions, and basically a century with a wide choice of emperors with particularly horrible deaths. And I've picked 2 of these men from the early and mid to later stages of the crisis. And we'll start with Maximinus Thrax, a horrible emperor. He reigned from 235 to 238, once again fairly short reign, typical for this time, and ancient writers remember him as mostly for his physical appearance, because he was like a giant. He was this frighteningly huge soldier emperor. It looks like he was like 2.5 meters tall, something ridiculous like that. And by the size we can see, he came to power through sheer military violence. Maximinus was a high-ranking officer, and he capitalized on the troops' disdain of the previous emperor, Severus Alexander, and he managed to convince the troops to murder the emperor and raise him to the purple instead. Sadly for the soldiers who supported him, they did not know that they were replacing a weak, ineffective emperor for a highly aggressive, ultra-authoritarian, and equally ineffective alternative. Maximinus ruled in pretty much the same way he had risen, by brute force alone. The way he gave himself legitimacy was pretty straightforward. It rested on 2 pillars. He exploited the greed of the troops by offering them bonuses and plunder, and by raising taxes on the rest of the citizenry to pay raises for the army, and through incredibly harsh discipline, punishing severely, sometimes with capital punishment, for even the slightest of offenses within his camp. Very short-sighted, by the way, on his part. This kind of hard hand was good in order for you to control your troops and take power, but that's just unsustainable when it came to winning the hearts of your supporters. In 238, the Senate elevated rival emperors against Maximinus, and he decided then to march into Italy to crush the revolt. But he had to stop at a city called Aquileia. The city resisted and forced Maximinus to enter a siege. His troops did not like that. They were short on supplies, they saw no clear end in sight for the siege, so the man from his own camp just went to his tent, and in good 3rd century fashion they killed Maximinus and his son on the spot. And records say that after months of resentment of the emperor, and the harsh treatment that he had on his camp, this hatred that was brewing all over these months, it started boiling over, and the troops entered a frenzy, apparently trampling and mutilating his body. And to show that the siege was done, they decided to just leave a message by cutting his head, putting it on a spike, and displaying it right next to the city walls to show that the siege was over. They then picked that spike with his head and paraded it all over Italy, all the way to Rome, to show it to the Senate and negotiate a reconciliation between the rebel troops and the rest of the Roman state. Quite another violent end, but I think he deserved it. And here we have a fairly interesting denarius of this man. Remember I mentioned he was a giant, right? If you look at this portrait, we can see these very exaggerated facial features of the emperor. And from these facial features, it's very likely that he suffered from some kind of gigantism, some type of disorder of the pituitary glands this is a kind of disorder that makes you secrete growth hormones at a massive rate and for way longer than you should. There's a moment where you're supposed to stop it or reduce drastically. And this resulted on his towering height. He was like 2 meters 50. If you're from the US, that's 8 feet 6 inches, so pretty massive. And we can see some other typical features of this disorder in his portrait. Like he has a super pronounced chin, a super pronounced eyebrow. So yeah, you can see that he had some sort of problem there. So the legends on this coin are fairly standard for the type. It reads Imperator Maximinus Pius Augustus. And the reverse that we have here is actually more interesting than you think. So it shows how Maximinus was initially, actually he was recognized by the Senate. In 235, when he became emperor, purely by being acclaimed by the troops, the Senate it found itself in a position that they just had to give in and recognize him. The army had too much power, he had control of the army, so despite them later on declaring him a public enemy when they saw they could make a bid for the power with another emperor, here they just had to accept it. And we have this really interesting testimony of his original acceptance by the Senate, because we have on the legends, we have the series of official titles traditionally bestowed upon a legitimate emperor. It reads Pontifex Maximus, Tribunicia Potestate Iterum, Consul, Pater Patria, similar to the previous coins we've seen. And this is such a great example to show how during the 3rd century, these old venerable traditions of the imperial office, they had practically no meaning. Maximinus never set foot on Rome. We see him displaying here the titles on coins simply because it was tradition, because to spell these titles on your coins was basically synonymous with legitimacy. But it was all for show. Maximinus didn't care if he had the powers of a tribune, if he was the chief priest of the Roman religion. He didn't care about any of this. And finally, at the center of the reverse, we have a confirmation of what truly gave Maximinus power. We have the figure of the emperor standing between two military standards, those carried by the legions into battle. I love this reverse. It's such a contrast. The central image is absolutely true, that what gave him power was the army, period, 100% real, while the legends are 100% propaganda. These had no connection to the reality during his reign. And let's continue with the fourth and probably most mysterious of the deaths in this episode, that of Emperor Valerian. For a change, this emperor did not die from the hands of a fellow Roman. Valerian reigned from 253 to 260 AD, and his reign was cut short after being defeated in battle against the Sasanian king Shapur, while Valerian was defending the eastern borders of the empire. Valerian had a co-emperor, his son Gallienus, and Gallienus was desperately trying to quell rebellions and invasions at the far west of the empire, so he was never able to conduct a campaign to rescue his father. And just like that, Valerian simply disappears from the public record, never to be heard of again. What happened to Valerian is up to this day a mystery. Some Roman sources, and especially the more scandalous ones, who try to frame the Persians as barbarians, they claim that Shapur used the captured emperor as a human footstool, forcing Valerian to be on his knees so the Persian king could mount his horse, while stepping on his back on the way to mounting the horse. And even darker versions say that after being tortured and killed, Valerian was skinned, his skin stuffed, and his body preserved as a trophy on display at the Sasanian king's throne room. These stories are gruesome, Jesus Christ, yeah, and they certainly made for powerful imperial propaganda, but they may say more about authors like making a fuss about Rome's humiliation of having an emperor being, oh my god, being taken captive. However, it's very likely that this never happened. In reality, Valerian may simply have remained a captive until his death, because Shapur was far too good of a politician and a commander as not to understand the value of holding a Roman emperor alive as both a prize and a political tool. And here, to illustrate him, we have a nice double denarius, or Antoninianus, of Valerian. These types we have here were made at two different mints, Antioch and Samosata. They were struck around 255 AD. Now, very interesting dark patina here. I know it's not related to the designs, but I quite enjoy this. The coin is almost black. This piece might have been unearthed in like a dry desert environment, which is actually compatible to the area where these were originally made. So we have the portrait of the emperor here looking right in this very characteristic style of the Eastern mints, which typically are less realistic compared to those of the Western mints. And on the legends, we have quite a mouthful. Valerian's full regnal name once again, but this time it gives his given name as well. It reads Imperator Caesar Publius Licinius Valerianus Pius Felix Augustus. And once again, the reverse of this coin is spectacular. It's so ironic. What we have here is a typical case of someone celebrating without actually succeeding on their plans, and then karma hitting them right back with excruciating irony. So there's a bit of wear on the coin, so the drawings will help us make sense of it. So at the center, we have two figures. To the right, there's Valerian, standing all proud in full military attire and holding a scepter, an attribute associated to Jupiter, the maximum symbol of authority. And to the left, handing over a laurel crown to the emperor, there is an image with a turreted headgear. This was like a crown that was meant to symbolize the towers of a city. So an incarnation of the cities of the East. Because this is Oriens, the personification of the East, the entire East of the empire. And the irony comes on the legends. It reads, Restitutor Orientis, the restorer of the Orient. Basically, Valerian is boasting that he restored the eastern frontier from the Sasanians, before even actually winning them in battle. Imagine that. I mean, it's understandable that these were tough times, that Valerian wanted to pass a message of calm and reassurance to people that Rome had everything under control, but to call himself the restorer of the Orient without even dealing with the existential threat to said Orient first? Well, my dear Valerian, I think you had it coming after such hubris. Poor man. And finally, I've saved the best, or should I say, the worst for last. Actually, you know what? Before I start, let me know in the comment section below which do you think was the worst death for a Roman emperor, or the most unusual one? Because what I'm discussing in this video is basically scratching the surface of all of the awful ways Roman emperors met their end. By the way, the Byzantines can enter in this list as well, because they also had some pretty horrible deaths. So I'll be interested to read what you have to say in the comment section. So anyway, let's look at this last one, because this one is really horrible. So if the death of these other four men must have been quite painful, but probably relatively quick, this poor bastard here didn't have the mercy of a quick death. Galerius was one of the original tetrarchs, part of Emperor Diocletian's brief experiment of dividing the command of the Roman Empire between four co-emperors. Galerius was emperor from 305 to 311, although this particular coin was made when he was a Caesar, one of the junior partners of the tetrarchy. So this particular piece was probably made a few years before that, between 295 and 304. Galerius became famous as one of the harshest persecutors of Christianity in the late empire, with many massacres directly attributed to his orders. Until, as early Christian chroniclers say, divine wrath finally fell on him as a punishment for the blood he had shed. One day, he was afflicted with some sort of disease. It began as an ulcer around his genitals. This ulcer quickly became infected, and the disease started spreading inwards. Doctors tried anything, cutting away the corrupted flesh, stitching it shut, while the emperor probably screamed in agony, only to watch the inflammation press on and all of the wounds open again. Contemporary sources say that after numerous attempts, quote, "the masters of healing, the best the empire could offer, simply withdrew." And from there, it only became worse. Now, a word of advice, this next quote is kinda unpleasant. You have been warned. It continues, "The wound spread into the lower body and bowels. The flesh blackened with gangrene, worms bred in the rotting tissue, and the stench became so overpowering that even those treating him could not endure it." It then continues mentioning an indescribable multitude of worms, and later his body dissolved into one mass of corruption. It took a whole year for the disease to kill the emperor. Now, I don't know about you, but this one, for me, it wins the prize. He certainly had some sort of highly aggressive bacteria-induced gangrene, and this is no joke. This is such a horrible thing to afflict you. Alright, so after this very pleasant description apart, let's take a look in more detail at this large bilen numus of Galerius. The numus was a denomination introduced by the Tetrarchy, so by Galerius included, in a very thorough monetary reform that was meant to completely overhaul the Roman monetary standard. It was, as you can see, a fairly large coin, 10 grams, very substantial, with a small percentage of silver in it, in its alloy, to give it some intrinsic value, around 5%. On the obverse we can see this rather generic, unrealistic portrait of the emperor. All of the 4 tetrarchs looked pretty much the same in their coins. You had to go to the legends and read them in order to actually know who you were looking at. In this case, we can read Maximianus Nobilicimus Caesar. Maximianus was also the name of his colleague, one of the senior emperors, but since only Galerius, who was also named Maximianus, as you can see, since only Galerius was ever Caesar, we can distinguish them in this way. If it is a Caesar, it has to be Galerius. Heading to the reverse, we have the image of the Genio Populi Romani, the genius of the Roman people. A genius is actually a rather complicated thing to explain. It was a concept more complex than that of a single personification. It wasn't simply like the incarnation of the Populi Romani, the Roman people. It was more like the combined effort, the souls, the creative life and capacity of the entire Roman people of doing heroic things. So it was more in this like deeper line. So here, Galerius and the Tetrarchs, they're making like this reference to the overall virtues that the Romans had to offer. Well, unless you were Christian by the looks of it, otherwise Galerius would just go after you. So, genius here is this naked figure. He wears nothing but a cloak over his shoulders on one arm. He also holds a cornucopia, the horn of abundance, making a reference to the resourcefulness of the Roman people, their capacity of like generating wealth and prosperity. And on the other, once again, the patera, the little pot used for liquid offerings. So a reference to the old religious traditions of the Roman state religion. It's a very adequate for the time when this coin was made, because at this time, you see, this coin was made in the early 4th century. So newer religions, not only Christianity in fact, were clearly on the rise on the empire. And the Tetrarchy tried really hard, but ultimately unsuccessfully, to once more push the old religion, the old Greco-Roman paganism, which gave them lots of legitimacy to like the imperial office. And finally, at the very bottom of the reverse, we have a little special thing about late Roman coins. They often show the initials of the mint where each coin was made. Here we have SIS for the mint of Siscia. So, stabbing, mutilation, being flayed alive and used as a footstool, and some good old-fashioned horrible diseases. The ancient world was a place of extreme scarcity, but if there was one thing that it had in abundance, it was ways of someone to suffer or have a terrible death. Even for powerful people like the Roman emperors. You know, despite our world currently not being in its best moments, it certainly puts into perspective, at least, the lives we live in. And, well, at least for me, it kind of makes me thankful for the life we have. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Leave a like and consider subscribing if you did. Happy collecting, and I'll see you soon. Let me give a special thank you to all of my amazing channel members and Patreons for their generous support. This channel would not be the same without your help. And if you would like to be part of this list, have early access to my videos when they are uploaded to YouTube, and a series of other perks, make sure to check out my Patreon page and my members tab on YouTube. Thank you very much.